welcome to Tales in the Dark. I know many of you enjoy relaxing with these videos, so I recommend turning down the volume until my voice is barely audible. It'll make the experience even more soothing. Before you close your eyes, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and enjoy listening. Story 1. The pristine surface of the lake stretched before me like polished obsidian, reflecting the silvery light of the full moon overhead. I had come to this remote cabin, nestled among ancient pines, seeking solitude and inspiration for my next novel. The gentle whisper of wind through needles above created a soothing melody that seemed to welcome me to this peaceful refuge. That first evening, I settled into the weathered wooden chair on the dock, wrapped in a soft wool blanket against the autumn chill. The water lapped quietly against the wooden posts, a rhythmic sound that seemed to slow my breathing and calm my racing thoughts. Stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky, their reflections dancing on the lake's surface like scattered diamonds. As twilight deepened into true night, I noticed something peculiar about the silence. It wasn't the complete absence of sound, but rather a rich tapestry of subtle noises that seemed to weave together into something almost musical. The rustling leaves, the distant call of a night bird, and the soft movement of water all blended into a harmony that felt both natural and somehow deliberately composed. I found myself drawn to this nighttime ritual, spending hours on the dock each evening. The lake had a way of making time feel fluid, minutes stretching into hours without notice. Sometimes I would bring my notebook, but more often I simply sat and listened, allowing the peaceful atmosphere to wash over me like gentle waves. On my fourth night, as the moon hung full and bright overhead, I first heard it, a sound unlike anything I had experienced before. It rose from the depths of the lake, a melody so faint I initially thought I was imagining it. The sound reminded me of whale song, but softer, more ethereal, as if coming from somewhere between sleep and waking. It carried notes of longing and joy intertwined, making my heart ache with a sweetness I couldn't explain. The song would come and go, never lasting more than a few minutes, and never quite the same twice. I began to notice patterns in its appearance. It seemed more likely to emerge on still nights when the moon was bright and the air held a certain crispness. I started keeping a journal, documenting each occurrence, trying to capture in words the ineffable quality of the music. Some nights, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the water, subtle disturbances in the mirror-like surface that couldn't be explained by wind or fish. Occasionally, I would see what looked like soft lights moving in the depths, glowing with a gentle blue-green luminescence that reminded me of bioluminescent plankton I had once seen in photographs. The locals at the small general store where I bought supplies seemed to know something, though they never spoke of it directly. When I mentioned the lake's nighttime sounds, they would exchange knowing looks and change the subject. One elderly woman, her face weathered by years of sun and wind, simply smiled and said, "The lake shares its secrets with those who know how to listen." As weeks passed, I found myself spending more time on the dock, waiting for the mysterious song. My novel lay forgotten inside the cabin, replaced by pages of descriptions attempting to capture the experience of these nights. The song began to feature in my dreams, calling to me with its haunting melody. I would wake in the early hours, unsure if I had been dreaming, or if the music had actually drifted through my window. One particularly clear night, as the song rose from the depths, I noticed something different. The lights beneath the surface seemed to move with more purpose, swirling in complex patterns that matched the rises and falls of the melody. They formed shapes that almost resolved into recognizable forms before dissolving back into abstract patterns. I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out toward them, to somehow bridge the gap between my world and whatever lay beneath those dark waters. As I leaned forward, my reflection in the water seemed to shift and change. For a brief moment, I thought I saw another face looking back at me. Not my own, but something older, wiser, with eyes that held depths as mysterious as the lake itself. The image lasted only a second before ripples disturbed the surface, but it left me with a profound sense of connection to something ancient and unknowable. The song grew stronger that night, and for the first time, I felt I could almost understand words within the melody. They weren't in any language I knew, yet they seemed to speak directly to something deep within my soul. The lights beneath the surface drew closer to the dock, their glow illuminating the weathered wood with a soft, otherworldly light. In that moment, I realized that the lake wasn't just a body of water. It was alive in some fundamental way I couldn't fully comprehend. The songs weren't simply sounds, they were communications, stories being shared by something that had existed here long before humans had come to these shores. The lights weren't mere reflections or bioluminescence, but the physical manifestation of whatever consciousness dwelled in the depths. As autumn deepened into winter, the nights grew longer and colder. I remained at the cabin, unable to leave, drawn back to the dock each evening by the possibility of hearing the song again. The locals stopped asking when I planned to return home, seeming to understand something I was only beginning to grasp. The lake had chosen to share its secret with me, and in doing so, had bound me to this place in ways I couldn't explain. The song changed with the seasons, taking on new tones and rhythms as ice began to form around the edges of the lake. Even in the deepest cold, a circle of water remained unfrozen near the dock, as if kept deliberately clear by whatever force created the music. The lights continued their dance beneath the surface, now reflecting off the crystalline edges of the ice in spectacular displays of color. Some nights now, I find myself humming along with the melody, though I never quite manage to capture its essence. The song has become part of me, woven into my dreams and memories like golden threads in a tapestry. I've stopped trying to explain it or understand it, content simply to be part of this ongoing mystery. My original manuscript remains unfinished, but I've found something far more valuable here by the lake. The locals no longer treat me as an outsider, and sometimes on especially clear nights, I notice others sitting quietly on distant shores, their faces turned toward the water with expressions of peaceful wonder. The lake continues its nightly symphony, and I continue to listen. Sometimes I think I'm closer to understanding the meaning behind the songs, the message being shared across the boundary between worlds. But perhaps true understanding isn't the point. Maybe the real gift is simply being here, being present for this endless performance, this gentle reminder that there are still mysteries in the world that defy explanation. As I sit here now watching the moon rise over the still waters, I feel the familiar stirring in the depths. The lights are beginning their slow dance below the surface, and the first notes of tonight's song are rising through the cool air. I wrap my blanket tighter and settle back in my chair, ready to lose myself once again in the ancient melody of the silent lake. Story 2. The autumn wind whispered through the sparse trees as I made my way up the winding path, my footsteps crunching softly on the gravel beneath. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, painting everything in shades of amber and deep purple. Before me stood the villa, a testament to forgotten elegance, its weathered stone facade holding secrets accumulated over generations. I had inherited this place from my grandmother, though I hadn't visited in over 20 years. My childhood memories of summers spent here had grown hazy, like old photographs fading at the edges. The sound of my boots against the gravel seemed to echo in the stillness of the approaching evening, accompanied only by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of a solitary bird. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves mingled with something older, something that reminded me of dusty books and forgotten rooms. As I approached the main entrance, I noticed how the ivy had claimed portions of the walls, its tendrils reaching up toward the second-floor windows like gentle green fingers caressing the stone. The key was heavy in my hand, its brass surface dulled with age. It turned in the lock with surprising smoothness, as if the house had been waiting for my return. The door opened with a soft groan, releasing a breath of cool air that carried the scent of wood polish and time. The foyer welcomed me with its familiar grandeur, though somewhat diminished by years of disuse. Dust motes danced in the dying sunlight that filtered through the tall windows, creating patterns that seemed to move with purpose across the worn carpet runner. The grandfather clock that had kept watch over this space for decades stood silent, its pendulum still, marking a moment frozen in time. I moved deeper into the house, my fingers trailing along the wooden paneling of the walls. Each room held echoes of the past. The drawing room with its elegant furniture draped in white sheets, the library with its rows of leather-bound books, their spines faded but still proud. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet in a way that seemed almost musical, as if the house were composing a melody of remembrance. As twilight settled outside, I began lighting old oil lamps I found throughout the rooms. Their warm glow created pools of gentle light that pushed back the growing darkness, though shadows still danced in the corners. The light caught the gilt frames of old portraits, making their subjects seem to shift slightly, their painted eyes following my movement through the rooms. It was in the library that I first noticed something peculiar. Among the carefully arranged books, one volume lay at an angle, disrupting the otherwise perfect alignment. When I went to straighten it, I found it warm to the touch, as if someone had recently held it. The sensation lingered on my fingertips as I carefully slid it back into place, noting its title, Collected Correspondence of the Hamilton Estate, 1876 to 1892. The kitchen retained its Victorian charm with copper pots hanging from ceiling racks and an old porcelain sink that gleamed dully in the lamplight. As I filled a kettle for tea, I could have sworn I heard the sound of footsteps overhead, soft and measured, moving from one room to another. The old pipes groaned as water flowed through them, and I told myself it was simply the house settling, though the footsteps had seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. While the water heated, I explored the dining room. The long table could seat 20 guests, though it had been years since it had hosted any gatherings. The chandelier above caught the light from my lamp, its crystals creating scattered rainbows across the walls. A place setting had been laid at one end of the table, a single china plate, a silver fork, and a neatly folded napkin. I was certain I hadn't done this, and my grandmother had passed away months ago. The plate bore no dust. The kettle's whistle drew me back to the kitchen, its sound eerily human in its pitch. As I prepared my tea, a cool draft brushed past me, carrying with it the faintest hint of lavender, my grandmother's preferred perfume. I turned, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway, but found only empty space and dancing shadows. Moving to the second floor, I discovered that someone had opened all the windows in the long gallery, allowing the evening air to flow through freely. The curtains billowed like gentle ghosts, and the moonlight now streaming in created patterns on the floor that seemed to form and reform into almost recognizable shapes. I moved to close each window, noting how they all opened onto the same view of the gardens below, where marble statues stood as silent sentinels among overgrown roses. In what had once been my bedroom, I found the bed made up with fresh linens, the corners tucked with military precision. On the bedside table sat a book I remembered from my childhood, a collection of fairy tales my grandmother would read to me. It lay open to my favorite story, the pages slightly ruffled by the breeze from the window. Beside it stood a glass of water that hadn't been there when I checked the room earlier. The night deepened, and with it came a strange sense of comfort despite the unexplained occurrences. The house seemed to breathe around me, its wooden bones expanding and contracting with the changing temperature. From somewhere deep within its walls came the sound of music, so faint it might have been imagination. The delicate notes of a piano playing a melody I almost recognized. I followed the sound, moving through the corridors with measured steps. The music grew neither louder nor fainter, maintaining its distance like a memory that refuses to come into focus. Each room I entered held its own small mystery. A chair slightly turned as if someone had just risen from it, a book opened to a meaningful passage, a chess set with a game in progress, though I couldn't remember starting one. In the conservatory, moonlight streamed through the glass ceiling, creating a natural spotlight on the piano that stood at its center. The sheet music on the stand was yellowed with age, but the notes were clearly visible. A nocturne my grandmother used to play. As I watched, the pages turned slowly, one by one, though there was no breeze to move them. I spent hours wandering the halls, each room offering new details that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Portraits smiled differently on second glance. Doors that had been closed stood open, and the temperature would change suddenly in certain spots, as if I were passing through invisible curtains of warm and cool air. The house never felt threatening, despite its mysteries. Instead, it seemed to be sharing its secrets with me gradually, like a grandmother teaching a child to bake by allowing them to add one ingredient at a time. Each unexplained occurrence felt like a gift rather than a warning, a gentle reminder that some places exist between the world we know and the ones we don't quite understand. As the night wore on, I found myself in the library again, settled into a high-backed leather chair that still held the impression of its last occupant. The book about the estate's correspondence had somehow made its way to the side table next to me. Opening it, I found pressed between its pages a letter written in my grandmother's distinctive hand, dated just weeks before her passing. "My dearest grandchild," it began, "by the time you read this, I will have become part of the house, as all its caretakers do. We don't leave. You see, we simply shift into its shadows, become one with its memories. The villa has always been more than wood and stone. It holds the echoes of all who have loved it, who have lived within its walls and contributed to its story. Now it's your turn to add your own chapter to its endless tale." The letter ended there, but I understood. The footsteps above, the music in the walls, the small signs of life throughout the house. They weren't haunting so much as they were welcoming. The villa wasn't just a building. It was a collection of moments, memories, and love, preserved in its own peculiar way. I settled deeper into the chair, feeling the weight of inheritance, not just of property, but of story and mystery. The lamp beside me flickered gently, and in its warm glow I could have sworn I saw my grandmother's reflection in the window, smiling her familiar smile. When I turned to look, there was only darkness beyond the glass, but the feeling of her presence remained. Outside, the moon continued its journey across the sky, casting ever-changing shadows through the windows. The house creaked and sighed around me, its sounds now as familiar as breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a clock began to chime midnight, though I knew all the clocks in the house had stopped long ago. I remained in the library until dawn, surrounded by books that held countless stories within their pages, in a house that was itself a living story. As the first light of morning began to paint the eastern sky, I realized I had found not just an inheritance, but a home, one that existed in the beautiful space between reality and dreams, where every creak of a floorboard might be a footstep from the past, and every draft might carry the whispered secrets of those who came before. The villa on the desolate height had welcomed me back. not as a visitor, but as a continuation of its eternal story. And as the sun rose, casting new shadows across the ancient floors, I knew that I too would eventually become part of its gentle mystery, another layer in its endless tale of time, memory, and the thin veil between what was and what is. Story 3. The soft autumn breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the gentle rustling of fallen leaves and the sweet, earthy scent of decay. I walked along the narrow dirt path that wound through the ancient forest, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles beneath. The late afternoon light filtered through the canopy above, creating a mesmerizing dance of shadows and golden rays that seemed to pulse with each passing cloud. I had discovered this trail quite by accident while seeking solitude from the relentless pace of modern life. What began as a simple escape had evolved into a daily ritual, one that brought me inexplicable comfort despite the growing sense that something about this place defied ordinary explanation. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, as if laden with memories that refused to settle into the earth. The wooden bench where I usually rested came into view, its weathered planks bearing the patina of countless seasons. As I approached, I noticed something unusual, a small leather-bound journal resting on its surface. The book's cover was worn smooth, its pages yellowed and slightly curled at the edges. I glanced around, but as always, I was alone on the path. Settling onto the bench, I carefully lifted the journal. Its leather was warm to the touch, despite the cool autumn air. Opening it revealed elegant handwriting in faded ink, the words flowing across the pages like dark water. The first entry was dated exactly 1 year ago. I found it at last, the place where shadows linger longer than they should, where time moves like honey and memories take physical form. I've watched them dance at dusk, these remnants of moments past, swirling like leaves in an unfelt wind. They know I'm here. They whisper things that sound like my name, but isn't, not quite. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned the page. The writing continued, each entry describing increasingly strange observations. The author wrote of shadows that moved independently of their casters, of whispered conversations carried on the wind in languages that felt familiar but impossible to understand. They described the way time seemed to fold in on itself here, how moments stretched and compressed like accordion bellows. As I read, the quality of light around me began to shift. The sun hadn't set, but the shadows beneath the trees grew deeper, more substantial. A gentle mist rose from the ground, curling around my ankles like curious cats. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and something sweeter, like old books and dried flowers. The journal spoke of a theory, that this path existed in a place where the fabric between worlds had worn thin. The author believed that memories and moments from other times, other possibilities, had begun to seep through. They weren't dangerous, these shadow memories, but they were hungry for attention, for acknowledgement of their existence. I found myself reading about encounters with shadow people who would appear at the corner of one's vision, only to dissolve when directly observed. The author described how they would mirror your movements, always maintaining the same distance, like echoes given form. Sometimes they would leave behind small objects, buttons, old coins, pressed flowers, items that seemed to fade away if removed from the path. The writing grew more intricate, more intimate. The author began addressing the shadows directly, as if they had developed a relationship with these ethereal beings. They wrote of learning to sit perfectly still, to quiet their thoughts until they could feel the brush of phantom fingers against their skin, could hear fragments of stories carried on the breeze. As I neared the final pages, the light around me continued to change. The shadows had grown so deep that they seemed almost solid, yet I could still read the words clearly, as if the pages themselves were gently luminescent. The last entry was different from the others, the handwriting more urgent, yet still maintaining its elegant flow. They've invited me to step across, to join them in their world of eternal twilight and endless stories. I understand now, this path isn't just a thin place between worlds, it's a gateway. The shadows aren't memories at all, but collectors of them. They gather the moments we let slip away, the choices we didn't make, the lives we might have lived. They keep them safe, preserve them like pressed flowers between the pages of reality. Tomorrow, at sunset, I will accept their invitation. This journal is my breadcrumb, my tether to the solid world. If you're reading this, you've been chosen too. They've seen something in you, a willingness to believe, perhaps, or a collection of particularly beautiful lost moments they wish to preserve. The choice will be yours, as it was mine. Watch the shadows. Learn to read their movements. When you're ready, they'll reach for you too. The final page was blank, save for a single pressed flower, a forget-me-not, its delicate blue petals somehow still vibrant despite the passage of time. As I stared at it, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. The shadows had begun to dance, taking on forms that seemed almost human. They moved with a grace that made my heart ache, as if they were performing a ballet choreographed from my own forgotten dreams. I closed the journal gently, feeling its warmth pulsing against my palms like a second heartbeat. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in watercolor shades of purple and gold. The shadows had grown bold in the fading light, their movements more deliberate. One seemed to extend toward me, like an offering hand. Standing slowly, I placed the journal back on the bench exactly as I had found it. The air hummed with possibility, with choices yet unmade. I could leave now, walk back the way I came, return to the world of solid things and linear time. Or I could stay, watch the shadows dance, and wait for their invitation. The path stretched before me, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Behind me, my own shadow seemed to lag slightly, as if reluctant to follow. Overhead, the first stars were beginning to emerge, their light somehow closer and more intimate than I remembered. The breeze carried the sound of distant whispers, and I found myself straining to understand their words. I'm still here, watching the shadows lengthen and dance. Sometimes I think I can see figures moving among the trees, their forms composed of twilight and memory. They mirror my movements, these shadow people, but their gestures carry a fluid grace that human muscles can't quite achieve. I've begun to recognize certain shapes, certain patterns in their dance. I think I'm starting to understand their language. The journal rests beside me, waiting for the next reader, the next potential dancer in this eternal twilight ballet. Soon I'll have to make my choice, to step back into the solid world or forward into theirs. But for now, I simply sit and watch as reality gently unravels around me, like a sweater caught on a branch, leaving behind only the most beautiful possibilities. Perhaps you'll find this path too someday. Perhaps you'll discover the journal, warm beneath your fingers, its pages filled with my words now instead of theirs. If you do, know that we're watching from the shadows, collecting moments like precious stones, preserving the might-have-beens and the almost-weres. We'll be waiting, my shadow friends and I, to see what choice you make when the time comes. After all, in a world where shadows can dance and memories take flight like autumn leaves, who's to say which reality is the truest? Which world is more solid, the one we can touch or the one that touches us? Story 4. The gentle patter of rain against my bedroom window had become a familiar lullaby over the past few weeks. Each droplet created a soft melody that seemed to whisper ancient secrets, drawing me deeper into contemplation as I lay in my antique four-poster bed. The house, passed down through generations of my family, held its own quiet mysteries, but none as compelling as the sound that had begun to weave itself into my dreams. It started as a distant murmur, barely distinguishable from the rainfall. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks with the old pipes, or perhaps the natural settling of a house that had weathered over a century of storms. But there was something different about this sound, a rhythm that felt purposeful, almost like a voice calling from somewhere deep within the surrounding forest. The rainfall intensified, drumming against the roof in a steady cadence. I found myself drawn to my window night after night, pressing my palm against the cool glass, feeling the subtle vibrations of the water droplets. The dense canopy of trees beyond my garden swayed gently in the autumn breeze, their leaves creating shadow patterns that danced across my wall in the dim moonlight. One particularly quiet evening, as I sat in my reading chair beside the crackling fireplace, I noticed something unusual about the sound. Beneath the consistent rainfall, there was a deeper resonance, a sound that reminded me of moving water, not the gentle trickle of a stream, but something more substantial. The sound seemed to emanate from the direction of the old stone wall that marked the edge of my property, where thick ivy had claimed the weathered rocks as its own. The longer I listened, the more certain I became that this was no ordinary sound of nature. It carried a quality that seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly within my chest. My grandmother had once mentioned something about a hidden waterfall somewhere on the property, but like many of her stories, I had attributed it to the fanciful imagination of a woman who spent too much time alone in this vast house. As days turned into weeks, I began to notice subtle changes in my daily routine. My sleep became deeper, filled with dreams of crystal-clear pools and ancient stone pathways. The sound of the hidden waterfall, for I had begun to think of it as such, seemed to grow stronger with each passing night. It was as if the very walls of my house had begun to breathe with its rhythm. One morning, I discovered an old leather-bound journal tucked away in the library. Its pages were filled with my grandmother's elegant handwriting, describing her own encounters with the mysterious sound. She wrote of following it through the dense undergrowth, guided by what she called the whispers of the waters. But the most intriguing entry spoke of a full moon night, when the sound had become so clear that it had led her to discover something extraordinary, though the details of her finding were frustratingly absent from the subsequent pages. The discovery of the journal coincided with increasingly vivid dreams. In them, I would find myself walking through moonlit gardens, following a silver thread of sound that always seemed to lead me toward the old stone wall. The ivy covering the wall appeared to pulse with a soft, phosphorescent light in these dreams, but I always woke before reaching my destination. As autumn deepened into winter, the rainfall became more frequent, and with it, the sound grew more distinct. I began to spend my evenings in the garden, wrapped in warm blankets, listening to the interplay between the rain and the mysterious waterfall. The air carried a crisp, earthy scent, mixed with something else, something older and more profound that I couldn't quite identify. The house seemed to respond to these changes as well. The wooden floors would creak in harmony with the distant water music, and sometimes in the corners of my vision, I would catch glimpses of soft, shifting lights that disappeared when viewed directly. The mirrors in the hallway occasionally reflected shadows that shouldn't have been there, moving like water across their surface. My grandmother's journal became my constant companion. I spent hours poring over her entries, noting the similarities between her experiences and my own. She wrote about the way the sound would intensify during certain phases of the moon, how it seemed to carry messages in a language just beyond understanding. There were detailed descriptions of the changes she observed in the garden, plants growing in unusual patterns, morning dew that sparkled with uncommon brilliance, and birds that would gather in perfect silence near the old wall. One entry particularly caught my attention. She described a night when the sound had transformed into what she called the voice of memory itself. The water's song, she wrote, had revealed to her the layered history of the land, not in words or images, but in pure sensation. She spoke of feeling the passage of centuries flow through her like a gentle stream, carrying with it fragments of lives lived long ago. The more time I spent listening to the waterfall, the more I began to understand what she meant. The sound had a way of shifting one's perception, making time feel less linear and more like a pool of still water, reflecting both past and present in its depths. I found myself experiencing moments of profound clarity, where the boundary between myself and my surroundings seemed to dissolve, leaving only the eternal voice of the falling water. Winter nights grew longer, and the sound of the waterfall became my constant companion. Sometimes, in the hours before dawn, I would wake to find my room filled with a soft, silvery light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the distant water. The air would feel thick with possibility, as if the veil between the ordinary world and something more mysterious had grown thin. My dreams became more vivid, filled with images of ancient stone steps leading down into earth, of crystal chambers where water sang its eternal song. I would wake with the feeling of having visited places that existed somewhere between reality and imagination, carrying with me fragments of melodies that seemed to answer questions I hadn't yet learned to ask. The old house began to reveal its secrets slowly, like a flower opening its petals to the morning sun. I discovered hidden panels in the library that contained more of my grandmother's writings, maps drawn with careful attention to the movement of underground streams, and sketches of symbols that seemed to dance on the page like ripples on water. As I delved deeper into these discoveries, I began to understand that the hidden waterfall was more than just a physical feature of the landscape. It was a voice that had called to my family for generations, a keeper of memories and mysteries that revealed themselves only to those who learned to listen with their whole being. Now, as I write this in my grandmother's journal, adding my own experiences to hers, I can hear the waterfall's song more clearly than ever. It speaks of things that cannot be captured in words alone, of the deep connection between memory and water, of the stories written in the very stones of this place, of the thin spaces where the ordinary world touches something far more ancient and profound. The rain continues to fall outside my window, its rhythm merging with the eternal song of the hidden waterfall. Sometimes, when the night is at its darkest and the house holds its breath in anticipation, I think I can almost see the path that leads to its source. But perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain just beyond our grasp, their power lying not in their resolution, but in the way they transform those who learn to live with their presence. And so I continue to listen, to dream, and to wonder. The whispers of the hidden waterfall have become part of my own story now, a gentle reminder that some of the most profound truths come to us not in moments of dramatic revelation, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the soft susurration of water falling endlessly in some secret place just beyond the edge of sight. Story 5. The grandfather clock in my study struck midnight, its deep, resonant chimes echoing through the old house like distant thunder. I sat in my leather armchair, watching as candlelight danced across the weathered pages of an ancient manuscript I had discovered earlier that day while organizing my late grandmother's belongings. The gentle patter of rain against the windows created a soothing rhythm, perfectly accompanying the soft crackling of the dying fire in the hearth. The manuscript, bound in faded leather and written in elegant, flowing script, told a peculiar tale of a tower that appeared only on certain nights when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky. According to the account, the tower would materialize in the midst of the foggy woods, its weathered stone walls seeming to emerge from the very mist itself. The writer described how the structure defied all logical explanation, as no foundation or ruins could ever be found during daylight hours. As I turned another delicate page, A cool breeze whispered through the room, causing the candle flames to flutter and cast shifting shadows on the walls. The scent of old books and wood polish mingled with something else, something ancient and ineffable, like the musty breath of forgotten centuries. My grandmother had always been a collector of curious stories and artifacts, but this particular manuscript felt different. The paper beneath my fingers carried a strange warmth, as if the words themselves held some residual energy from the events they described. The next passage caught my attention with particular force. It detailed how the tower would call to certain individuals, drawing them with an irresistible pull that manifested as a soft, melodic humming just at the edge of hearing. The writer claimed that those who heard the call would find themselves wandering through the woods on foggy nights, guided by nothing more than this ethereal sound and an inexplicable certainty of direction. I found myself pausing in my reading, suddenly aware of a faint musical tone threading through the steady drumming of the rain. At first, I dismissed it as imagination, my mind playing tricks after being immersed in such an atmospheric tale. But the sound persisted, a gentle, almost subliminal vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep within my chest. Setting the manuscript aside, I moved to the window. The night beyond the glass was thick with fog, transforming the familiar landscape of my grandmother's estate into something dreamlike and undefined. The rain had softened to a fine mist, and through it I could see the woods at the property's edge taking on strange new shapes in the moonlight. The humming grew slightly stronger as I stood there, and I noticed that my breath had begun to leave faint traces on the window pane, despite the warmth of the room. Each exhalation created delicate patterns of frost that spread like silver ferns across the glass before slowly fading away. This unusual phenomenon should have alarmed me, but instead, it filled me with a sense of peaceful wonder. Without conscious decision, I found myself reaching for my coat. The mansion's heavy front door opened silently, as if expecting my departure. The night air enveloped me in its cool embrace, carrying the sweet scent of wet earth and autumn leaves. My feet moved of their own accord, following a path I had never known existed, but somehow felt as familiar as my own heartbeat. The woods welcomed me with gentle fingers of mist that curled around my shoulders like a shawl. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, creating pools of silver light that seemed to guide my way. The humming had become a constant companion now, not growing louder but rather more present, as if it originated from within my own mind rather than any external source. As I walked, I began to notice subtle changes in my surroundings. The trees appeared older, their bark taking on patterns that resembled ancient script. Moss-covered stones emerged from the earth in circular arrangements that suggested purpose rather than chance. The very air felt charged with a quiet energy, like the moment before a summer storm. Then I saw it, the tower. It rose before me like a dream made solid, its stone surface gleaming with a soft, pearlescent light that seemed to come from within, rather than reflect from without. The structure was both impossibly old and perfectly preserved, as if time itself flowed differently around its walls. Ivy grew in intricate patterns across its surface, forming designs that shifted subtly when viewed from different angles. The entrance was a simple arched doorway, unadorned except for a series of shallow reliefs that appeared to change their depicted scenes as the moonlight played across them. No door barred the way, only a threshold that seemed to ripple like the surface of still water. The humming emanated from within, now carrying undertones of what might have been distant voices, or perhaps the memory of voices. I stood before the entrance, watching as tendrils of fog wound their way around the tower's base and spiraled upward into the night sky. The manuscript had mentioned this moment, the choice to cross the threshold. According to its pages, some who found the tower simply stood in contemplation before turning away, while others stepped through and were changed by what they discovered within. The air grew thick with possibility. I could feel the weight of countless stories pressing against me, each one a potential future branching out from this singular moment. The tower waited, patient and eternal, neither encouraging nor discouraging my decision. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat stretching out like honey dripping from a spoon. Through the rippling threshold, I caught glimpses of what might have been a spiral staircase, its steps worn smooth by the passage of countless feet over unknowable years. Sometimes the stairs appeared to lead upward, sometimes down, and occasionally they seemed to extend in impossible directions that my mind struggled to comprehend. The longer I stood there, the more I began to notice details that seemed to shift at the corner of my vision. Windows that changed position when looked at directly, stones that bore different patterns with each blink, shadows that moved against the flow of moonlight. Yet none of these impossible things felt threatening. Instead, they created a sense of profound peace, as if I were witnessing the gentle breathing of reality itself. I raised my hand, letting my fingers hover just above the rippling threshold. The air there felt different, warmer, somehow older, carrying scents of places and times I had never known but somehow remembered. The humming synchronized with my heartbeat, creating a harmony that seemed to bridge the gap between the world I knew and whatever lay beyond. In that moment, I understood what my grandmother had known. The tower was not simply a structure that appeared on certain nights. It was a question made manifest in stone and shadow, asking each visitor to define their own answer about the nature of reality and mystery. Some found their answer in simply knowing it existed, while others needed to step through and explore its secrets. Standing there in the gentle mist, surrounded by the quiet music of an ancient mystery, I felt no urgency to make my choice. The tower would wait, as it had waited for countless others before me. Its patience was infinite, its mystery eternal. Whether I chose to step through the threshold or turn back toward home, I knew that the tower had already changed me in ways I would spend years understanding. The moon continued its arc across the sky, and the fog wove its endless patterns through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly into the night, its voice melding with the tower's gentle humming. Time flowed like water around this moment of perfect stillness, where all possibilities existed simultaneously, and every choice was both made and unmade. I stood there, balanced between what was and what might be, letting the peace of uncertainty wash over me like waves on a distant shore. The tower's light pulsed almost imperceptibly, matching the rhythm of my breathing, and in that synchronicity, I found a profound truth. Sometimes the most powerful mysteries are those we choose to let remain mysteries. Behind me, the path I had followed still wound through the misty woods, leading back to the warmth and solidity of my grandmother's house. Before me, the threshold rippled with infinite possibility. Both choices felt equally right, equally sacred. And so I stood, perfectly content in that moment of endless potential, letting the tower's song fill my heart with its ancient melody. The night deepened around us, the tower, the woods, and me, each of us keeping our own counsel as the moon traced its patient arc across the star-strewn sky. The manuscript had been right about one thing above all others. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but rather experienced, their power lying not in their resolution, but in their ability to remind us that wonder still exists in the world, if only we have the courage to stand before it and simply be. Story 6. The gentle whisper of wheat stalks swaying in the evening breeze had always been my favorite lullaby. Growing up on the old family farm, I had learned to read the different songs the wind could play through the golden fields, from the soft rustling of a calm summer night to the urgent whispers that preceded a storm. But on this particular autumn evening, as I sat on my grandmother's old rocking chair on the wraparound porch, The wheat seemed to be singing a melody I had never heard before. The sun was setting behind the endless rows of grain, painting the sky in watercolor hues of amber and lavender. A cool mist had begun to settle over the field, creating an ethereal blanket that danced between the stalks. The wooden slats of the porch creaked softly beneath my chair, a familiar sound that had accompanied countless evenings of quiet contemplation. My grandmother's antique wind chimes tinkled softly in the growing darkness, their brass tubes creating a gentle harmony with the wheat's whispers. The sweet, earthy scent of ripening grain mingled with the crisp autumn air, bringing back memories of harvests long past. I wrapped my weathered quilt tighter around my shoulders, letting its familiar weight comfort me as I watched the last rays of sunlight paint golden highlights across the misty field. That's when I first noticed it, a subtle difference in the way the wheat moved. Near the center of the field, perhaps 100 yards from the porch, a small circular area of stalks swayed in a different rhythm than the surrounding grain. While the evening breeze gently pushed the wheat from east to west, these stalks moved in a slow, clockwise pattern, as if they were following the rim of an invisible wheel. I blinked slowly, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks in the fading light. The rich aroma of brewing chamomile tea drifted from the mug beside me, its warmth creating lazy spirals of steam in the cooling air. As I reached for the cup, letting its heat seep into my palms, I continued to watch the strange movement in the field. The circular pattern grew more distinct as darkness settled over the farm. The wheat stalks in that area seemed to glow with a subtle luminescence, as if they had captured the last rays of sunset and held them close. It reminded me of the stories my grandmother used to tell, tales of ancient farming spirits and guardians of the harvest that she had learned from her own grandmother. The wind chimes sang a little louder, drawing my attention to the changing breeze. The air had grown heavier, thick with moisture and the promise of evening fog. The temperature dropped slightly, causing the old wooden boards beneath my feet to contract with a soft groan. As I watched, tendrils of mist began to weave through the wheat field, creating intricate patterns that seemed to spiral toward the glowing circle. I found myself speaking softly into the gathering darkness, reciting one of my grandmother's old rhymes about the wheat spirits. The words fell from my lips like drops of honey, slow and sweet, mixing with the evening sounds. In response, the circular pattern in the field began to pulse gently, its light ebbing and flowing like a distant lighthouse beacon. My tea had grown cold, forgotten in my hands as I watched the mesmerizing display. The moon rose slowly behind me, its silver light catching the dewdrops that had begun to form on the wheat stalks. Each droplet became a tiny mirror, reflecting and refracting the strange glow from the circle. The effect was breathtaking. Thousands of tiny stars scattered throughout the field, twinkling in harmony with the mysterious light at its center. Time seemed to flow differently as I sat there, rocking slowly in my grandmother's chair. The rhythm of the creaking wood merged with the whispers of wheat and the gentle song of the wind chimes. My breathing slowed to match this natural symphony, and I felt myself sliding into a state of peaceful meditation. In this tranquil state, I began to notice more subtle changes in the field. Small waves of movement rippled outward from the glowing circle, like rings spreading across a still pond. The wheat stalks bobbed and swayed in these waves, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing, ancient letters drawn in living gold, appearing and disappearing too quickly to read. The mist continued to thicken, and within its swirling depths, I caught glimpses of something more. Shadow forms moved through the field, insubstantial as smoke, but purposeful in their movements. They seemed to be tending to the wheat, their ghostly hands caressing the stalks with infinite care. I was reminded of the stories my grandmother told about the ancestors who watched over the fields, ensuring the prosperity of future generations. The night deepened, and stars emerged in the velvet sky above. Their light seemed to connect with the glowing circle below, creating barely visible threads of silver that linked heaven and earth. The wind chimes played a slower melody now, their notes lengthening into a dreamy lullaby that perfectly accompanied the ethereal scene before me. Hours passed like minutes as I sat wrapped in my quilt, watching the mysterious display. The glowing circle never faded, but it did change, sometimes expanding slightly, other times contracting, always moving with a purpose I could sense but not quite understand. The shadow figures continued their work, moving with increasing purpose as midnight approached. When the old grandfather clock inside struck 12, its deep tones rolling across the porch like distant thunder, the circle of wheat began to spin faster. The luminescence intensified, and for a brief moment I thought I could see something rising from the center, a pillar of golden light that reached toward the stars. The shadow figures gathered around it, their forms becoming more distinct in its radiance. And then, as gently as it had begun, the display began to fade. The circle of wheat slowed its spinning, the light dimmed, and the shadow figures melted back into the mist. The wind chimes offered a final, crystalline note that hung in the air like a farewell. Soon, only the normal nighttime movements of the wheat field remained, though the air still hummed with lingering energy. I sat for a while longer, letting the regular rhythm of the wheat field wash over me. The moon had risen high, casting silver light across the now peaceful field. My grandmother's quilt felt heavier around my shoulders, weighted with the wisdom of generations who had watched over these fields. As I finally rose to go inside, my joints stiff from sitting so long, I caught one last glimpse of movement in the field. A single stalk of wheat near the porch bent gently toward me, even though there was no wind. In its golden head, I saw a tiny spark of the same luminescence that had filled the circle, winking at me like a distant star before fading into the night. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the wheat field's gentle song, I understood why my grandmother had spent so many evenings on that porch. Some secrets reveal themselves only to those who are patient enough to sit quietly and observe, who are willing to let the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary blur like morning mist over a field of wheat. I never told anyone else what I saw that night, but I returned to the porch every evening, wrapped in my grandmother's quilt, watching and waiting. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the glowing circle, or see the shadow figures moving among the wheat. More often, I simply sit and listen to the wind's song through the stalks, knowing that some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than explained, felt rather than understood. The wheat field keeps its secrets, sharing them only with those who have learned to listen with their hearts as well as their ears. And on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the mist rolls in from the fields, I can still hear my grandmother's voice in the wind chimes, reminding me that the most beautiful mysteries are those that remain just beyond our grasp, like starlight reflected in a sea of golden grain. Story 7. The autumn evening wrapped around me like a soft, worn blanket as I made my way along the old dirt path leading to my grandmother's cottage. The air carried the sweet scent of decaying leaves, mingled with the earthy aroma of moss-covered trees. My footsteps fell quietly on the dampened ground, each step releasing a gentle whisper of moisture from the soil beneath. Through the growing darkness, I could make out the silhouettes of ancient oaks and maples, their branches reaching toward the darkening sky like gnarled fingers. The last remnants of daylight filtered through the canopy above, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and sway with each passing breeze. The forest was preparing for its nightly transformation, that magical time when day surrenders to twilight. As I walked, a gentle mist began to rise from the ground, curling around my ankles like ghostly cats seeking attention. The fog formed delicate tendrils that swayed and twisted in ways that seemed almost purposeful, as if responding to music I couldn't quite hear. There was something mesmerizing about the way it moved, something that made me slow my pace to watch its graceful dance. The temperature dropped ever so slightly, and I pulled my sweater closer around my shoulders. The wool caught against my skin with a familiar comfort, reminding me of countless autumn evenings spent in these woods. But tonight felt different somehow. The fog continued to thicken, not in the usual way that obscured vision, but rather in a manner that enhanced every detail it touched. Tree trunks gained an ethereal glow where the mist caressed their bark, and fallen leaves seemed to shimmer with an inner light. I paused beside an old oak tree, its trunk wider than any other in this part of the woods. My grandmother used to tell me stories about this tree, claiming it was older than time itself. As I stood there, the fog began to move in peculiar patterns, forming perfect circles that expanded outward like ripples in a pond. Yet there was no wind to drive this movement. The air was completely still. The circles of mist began to intersect, creating intricate patterns that reminded me of the lace doilies my grandmother kept on her dining room table. These patterns held their shape far longer than they should have, defying the natural tendency of fog to dissipate and reform randomly. I found myself swaying slightly, matching the rhythm of their movement without conscious thought. In the distance, I could make out the warm glow of my grandmother's cottage windows, but the sight seemed somehow less urgent than the dancing fog before me. The mist had begun to take on a subtle luminescence, barely noticeable at first, like starlight filtered through clouds. This gentle radiance outlined every whirl and eddy in the fog, revealing complex geometries that seemed impossible in nature. Time became fluid as I watched the display. Minutes might have passed, or hours, I couldn't be sure. The forest had fallen into an unusual silence, not the oppressive quiet of danger, but rather the respectful hush of an audience watching a performance. Even the nocturnal creatures that typically began their evening chorus seemed to have paused to observe. As I stood there, I began to notice something else in the fog's dance, a pattern that felt familiar, yet just beyond recognition. It reminded me of something my grandmother once told me about the woods, about how they hold memories in their very soil. She spoke of nights when the veil between what is and what might be grows thin, when nature itself tries to communicate with those willing to listen. The fog continued its elaborate ballet, and within its swirling patterns, I started to see what looked like figures taking shape. They were never quite distinct enough to name, more like suggestions of form that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them directly. But in my peripheral vision, they seemed to move with purpose, performing an ancient ceremony that had been repeated countless times in these woods. A cool breeze finally stirred the branches overhead, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from my grandmother's chimney. The spell began to gently break, like waking from a dream you wish would continue. The fog's dance slowly lost its geometric precision, returning to the more familiar random patterns of natural mist. But the luminescence remained, now spread throughout the forest like countless fireflies frozen in mid-flight. I resumed my walk toward the cottage, but with each step I found myself looking back over my shoulder. The fog continued to move, but now it seemed to be following me, not in a threatening way, but rather like a curious child wanting to share a secret. It swirled around my feet and occasionally reached up to brush against my hands with a touch as light as spider silk. When I finally reached my grandmother's front porch, I turned one last time to look at the woods. The fog had settled into a gentle blanket across the forest floor, appearing completely ordinary once again. But as I watched, a single tendril rose up and performed one final pirouette before dissolving into the night air. That evening, as I sat with my grandmother by her fireplace, the warmth of her herbal tea seeping into my hands through the old ceramic mug, I considered telling her about what I'd seen. But something held me back, not fear or uncertainty, but rather a sense that some experiences are meant to be held close, like precious stones that lose their luster when exposed to too much light. She must have sensed something in my silence, though, because she smiled knowingly and said, "The woods have their own way of speaking to those who pay attention." Then she returned to her knitting, the soft clicking of her needles mixing with the crackling of the fire, creating a rhythm that reminded me of the fog's dance. Years have passed since that evening, and I've walked that path countless times since. The fog often rises as darkness falls, but it has never again danced quite the same way. Sometimes, though, when the light is just right and the air is perfectly still, I catch glimpses of geometric patterns forming in the mist, like an echo of that mysterious performance. I've come to understand that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but rather appreciated like music that moves us without our understanding why. The dancing fog taught me that magic doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic revelations. Sometimes it simply invites us to pause, to observe, and to accept that there are things in this world that exist in the space between what we know and what we dream. And on quiet evenings, when I sit by my own fireplace and watch the shadows play across the walls, I think about that fog and its mysterious dance. I wonder if somewhere in those woods it's still performing its ethereal ballet, waiting for another solitary wanderer to pause and witness its ancient silent story. Story 8. The winter wind whispered through bare branches, creating a gentle symphony that matched the rhythm of my breathing. I stood at the edge of my property, watching as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered ground. The skeletal trees stretched their naked limbs toward the pewter sky, their dark silhouettes drawing intricate patterns against the fading light. My small cottage, nestled at the forest's edge, had always been a sanctuary of peace and solitude. The wooden walls held the warmth of countless fires, and the windows reflected the soft glow of my reading lamp on quiet evenings. But lately, something had changed in the atmosphere surrounding my home. It wasn't an unwelcome change, exactly, more like the subtle shift from one season to another, barely perceptible yet undeniably present. It began with the sounds. At first, they were so faint I thought they were merely tricks of the wind, gentle whispers that seemed to carry fragments of words. They came most often at dusk, when the boundary between day and night grew thin, and the world settled into its evening routine. The sounds reminded me of distant conversations, like the murmur of voices from another room, just beyond the threshold of comprehension. I found myself spending more time on my porch, wrapped in my grandmother's old quilt, listening. The wooden boards beneath my feet would creak softly, keeping time with the swaying of the trees. The air carried the crisp scent of pine needles and wood smoke, mingling with the earthier notes of decay that marked the transition from autumn to winter. One particular evening, as I sat in my usual spot, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, I noticed something different about the way the branches moved. While most swayed in the natural rhythm of the wind, one particular branch on an old oak tree seemed to move with its own purpose. It beckoned like a finger, curling inward before stretching out again, as if inviting me to step closer. The rational part of my mind dismissed this observation. Branches move in mysterious ways after all, especially in the deceptive light of dusk. But something about that gentle motion stirred a memory I couldn't quite grasp, like a word that sits at the tip of your tongue, refusing to materialize. I began keeping a journal of these occurrences. The leather-bound notebook, filled with descriptions of sounds, movements, and the strange feelings that accompanied them. My handwriting flowed across the pages, recording each detail with careful attention. Today, the whispers seemed clearer, I wrote one evening. They carried a melody I almost recognized, like a lullaby from childhood, but whenever I tried to focus on the tune, it slipped away like water through my fingers. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, I noticed other subtle changes. Objects in my house would shift positions ever so slightly. A book that had been lying flat would be found standing upright, or a chair would be angled differently than I remembered leaving it. These changes were so minor that I might not have noticed them if I hadn't developed such acute awareness of my surroundings. The most intriguing incidents always happened in the hour before sunset. The light would take on a golden quality, filtering through the trees in such a way that the shadows seemed to dance. During these moments, the whispers grew more distinct, though never quite clear enough to make out actual words. They carried emotions rather than meaning, sometimes wistful, sometimes joyful, but always with an underlying sense of peace. I found myself looking forward to these twilight encounters. They became a form of meditation, a daily ritual that helped me transition from the busyness of day to the tranquility of night. I would sit on my porch, sometimes reading, sometimes simply observing, and let the mysterious atmosphere envelop me like a comfortable blanket. One evening, as I was preparing for my usual twilight vigil, I discovered an old photograph tucked between the pages of a book I hadn't opened in years. The image showed my grandmother standing in front of the cottage, much younger than I had ever known her. She was looking at something beyond the camera's frame, a gentle smile playing on her lips. Behind her, the same oak tree that now beckoned to me spread its branches protectively. The photograph stirred something in my memory, stories my grandmother used to tell me about the forest and its inhabitants. She would speak of the trees as if they were old friends, each with its own personality and history. At the time, I had dismissed these tales as the fanciful musings of an elderly woman, but now they took on new meaning. That night, the whispers seemed to carry fragments of her voice, soft and melodic, just as I remembered it from my childhood. The branch of the old oak tree moved with particular grace, its motion reminiscent of my grandmother's gentle hand gestures when she was deep in conversation. As winter deepened, the mystery of the forest became more pronounced, yet somehow more natural. The bare trees no longer seemed stark or lonely. Instead, they appeared to be in a state of peaceful meditation, their branches reaching toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. The whispers became a familiar presence, as comforting as the sound of rain on the roof or the crackle of logs in the fireplace. I began to notice patterns in the movement of the branches and the timing of the whispers. They seemed most active when the moon was waxing, and particularly vocal during the hour when day transformed into night. Sometimes on very still evenings, I could almost convince myself that I saw shapes moving among the trees, not solid forms, but rather suggestions of presence, like the after-image that remains when you close your eyes after looking at a bright light. My journal entries grew more detailed, filled with observations about the changing quality of light, the various tones in the whispered voices, and the way the air seemed to thicken with meaning during certain moments. Tonight, I wrote, the whispers carried the scent of spring, though winter still holds the land in its grip. It reminded me of the way grandmother's garden would smell just before the first flowers broke through the soil. As I spent more time observing and listening, I began to notice that the mysterious phenomena weren't limited to the forest. Small changes occurred inside my cottage as well. The temperature would fluctuate in certain rooms, creating pockets of warmth that felt like embraces. Objects would be arranged in ways that seemed meaningful. 3 pine cones placed in a perfect triangle on the windowsill, or my grandmother's old shawl draped over the back of a chair in a way that caught the evening light just so. These occurrences should have been unsettling, but they weren't. Instead, they filled me with a sense of being cared for, as if the cottage itself had become a living entity, working in harmony with the forest to create an atmosphere of peaceful coexistence. The boundary between inside and outside, between the mundane and the mysterious, began to blur in the most delightful way. One particularly cold evening, as I sat in my usual spot with a fresh cup of tea, I heard something different in the whispers. Among the usual gentle murmurs, a clearer voice emerged, not in words exactly, but in a melody that I recognized immediately. It was a lullaby my grandmother used to sing, one I hadn't thought about in years. The notes floated on the winter air, carried by the wind and echoed by the swaying branches. Without thinking, I found myself humming along, my breath visible in the cold air. As I did, the movement of the branches seemed to synchronize with the melody, creating a visual harmony that matched the musical one. The old oak tree's beckoning branch swayed in perfect time, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw my grandmother's smile in the pattern of shadows it cast. That night, I made a final entry in my journal. Perhaps the whispers were never meant to be fully understood. Like the space between sleeping and waking, or the moment between one season and the next, some things exist in a state of beautiful ambiguity. The voice among the bare trees speaks in a language older than words, telling stories that can only be felt in the heart. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the whispers remained, though they changed with the seasons. They became part of the natural rhythm of my days, as familiar as my own heartbeat. The mystery never fully resolved itself, but I came to understand that some questions don't need answers. Sometimes the mystery itself is the answer. The bare trees still reach their branches toward the sky, still dance in the twilight, still seem to beckon with gentle movements. And in the quiet moments between day and night, when the light takes on that special golden quality, I sit on my porch and listen. The whispers continue their ancient conversation, and though I may never fully understand their words, I know I am part of their story, just as my grandmother was before me. Some nights, when the moon is full and the wind moves just right through the trees, I think I catch glimpses of other stories unfolding in the forest. Tales written in shadow and light, in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next. But these are stories for another time, whispered by voices that speak in the language of leaves and starlight, understood only by those who learn to listen with their hearts instead of their ears. Story 9. The autumn wind whispered through the ancient cemetery gates, carrying with it the gentle rustling of fallen leaves and the faint scent of chrysanthemums. As the newly appointed caretaker of these hallowed grounds, I had grown accustomed to the serene solitude that accompanied my nightly rounds. The soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots provided a rhythmic backdrop to my thoughts as I made my way along the winding paths between weathered headstones and ornate monuments. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the cemetery's rolling hills. Its silvery light filtered through the branches of century-old oak trees, creating intricate patterns on the frost-kissed grass below. There was something uniquely peaceful about these grounds at night, a tranquility that seemed to transcend the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. My predecessor had left rather suddenly, though that wasn't entirely unusual in this line of work. Most people found the constant reminder of mortality too heavy a burden to bear, but I had always felt different about it, finding a strange comfort in tending to these final resting places. Each grave told a story, each name etched in stone represented a life lived, memories made, and loved ones left behind. The old stone crypt that stood at the cemetery's heart had always drawn my attention. Unlike the other mausoleums scattered throughout the grounds, this one remained unmarked, its weathered facade bearing no family name or dates. According to the cemetery records, it predated all other structures on the property, yet no documentation existed regarding its occupants or origin. Tonight, as I approached the crypt on my regular patrol, something felt different. The air grew notably still, and the ambient sounds of the night seemed to fade into a hushed reverence. My flashlight's beam played across the crypt's ancient stones, revealing subtle details I had never noticed before. Delicate carvings that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, and symbols that appeared to have been deliberately worn away by time or human hands. The heavy iron door had always been secured with a padlock older than I was, its key long lost to history. But this evening, as my light fell upon it, I noticed something peculiar. The lock hung slightly askew, and a thin layer of fresh rust dust had collected on the ground beneath it, as if it had recently been disturbed. Drawing closer, I caught the faintest whisper of music drifting from within the crypt. It wasn't quite a melody, more like the memory of one, barely perceptible even in the cemetery's profound silence. The sound reminded me of a music box my grandmother once owned, its notes tinged with both sweetness and melancholy. My rational mind suggested that I should report this to the cemetery board immediately, but something held me there, transfixed by the gentle sway of shadows around the crypt's entrance. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, though the air remained perfectly still. My flashlight began to flicker, its beam growing weaker with each passing moment. As I stood there, contemplating my next move, a soft green glow began to emanate from the narrow gaps between the crypt's stones. It pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat, casting an ethereal light that seemed to bend and flow like water. The effect was mesmerizing rather than frightening, creating a sense of peaceful wonder rather than fear. The music grew slightly stronger, and I could now discern what sounded like distant whispers intertwined with the melody. They spoke in languages I didn't understand, yet their tone carried no malice. Instead, they seemed to be sharing secrets, stories perhaps, meant only for those patient enough to listen. I found myself seated on a nearby bench, watching the interplay of light and shadow across the crypt's ancient surface. Time seemed to lose its meaning as I observed the gentle display. The moon continued its arc across the sky, and occasionally I caught glimpses of what appeared to be figures moving within the light, though they were gone whenever I tried to focus on them directly. Throughout the night, other curious phenomena manifested around the crypt. Small orbs of light, like fireflies made of mist, would occasionally emerge from the stonework, dance briefly in the air, and then fade away. The temperature would fluctuate unexpectedly, creating small eddies of fog that swirled and twisted into shapes that almost seemed deliberate. Most intriguing were the moments when the whispers aligned into something almost comprehensible. They seemed to be telling stories of lives long past, of joy and sorrow, of love and loss. Though I couldn't understand the words themselves, the emotions they carried were universal and deeply moving. As dawn approached, the phenomena gradually began to fade. The green glow dimmed, the music grew fainter, and the whispers slowly receded into silence. The morning dew began to settle on the grass around me, and the first birds of dawn started their morning songs. When I finally rose from the bench, my joints stiff from sitting still for so long, I approached the crypt one final time. The padlock now hung exactly as it had for all the years prior, with no sign of the rust dust I had noticed earlier. The stones showed no trace of the mysterious carvings or symbols I had observed throughout the night. In the weeks that followed, I continued my nightly rounds as usual. The crypt remained silent and still, showing no signs of the extraordinary display I had witnessed. Yet something had fundamentally changed in my relationship with the cemetery. The grounds felt more alive somehow. as if that night had revealed a hidden dimension to this place of rest. I began to notice other subtle changes as well. Flowers would appear on untended graves, their origins unknown. The wind chimes in the memorial garden would play in perfect harmony even on still nights. And sometimes, in the moments between twilight and true night, I would catch the faintest echo of that distant music box melody. I never reported what I saw that night to the cemetery board. Some experiences, I realized, are meant to be kept close to the heart, like precious secrets shared between old friends. The crypt had shown me something profound about the nature of death and memory, about the thin veil that separates the world we know from the mysteries that lie beyond. Now, as I make my rounds each night, I carry with me a deeper appreciation for my role as caretaker. I'm not just maintaining grounds and tending to graves. I'm keeping watch over a place where the boundaries between past and present, between memory and reality, grow thin. The crypt stands as it always has, silent and ancient, but I know now that it holds more than just earthly remains. It guards stories, memories, and perhaps even fragments of souls that aren't quite ready to fade into the great unknown. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, when the moon is full and the air is still, I'll sit on that same bench and wait. The green glow never returns with the same intensity as that first night, but there are moments when I catch glimpses of it, like a friendly wink from an old acquaintance. The whispers, too, occasionally return, carried on the gentlest of breezes, reminding me that in this place of endings, there are still stories being told, still mysteries unfolding, still wonders to be discovered by those willing to sit quietly and listen. And perhaps that's the true purpose of a cemetery caretaker. Not just to tend to the physical remnants of lives past, but to serve as a witness to the subtle magic that lingers in these sacred spaces. To understand that death is not an ending, but a transformation, and that some stories continue long after the last words have been carved in stone. As I write these words in my nightly log, I can hear the distant chime of the cemetery gates moving in the wind. The sound mingles with the rustling leaves and the soft hooting of an owl, creating a natural symphony that seems to echo the mysterious melody from that extraordinary night. The crypt stands silently in the distance, its secrets held close, waiting perhaps for the next caretaker who will be patient enough to witness its mysteries. Until then, I maintain my vigil, honored to be the keeper of not just this cemetery, but of the stories, the memories, and the gentle mysteries that make this place so much more than just a field of stone markers. In the end, I've learned that every cemetery is more than a collection of graves. It's a library of lives, a gallery of memories, and sometimes on special nights when the veil grows thin, a theater where the past performs for those willing to watch and wonder. Story 10. The gentle patter of autumn rain against the window panes filled the dusty antique shop with a soothing rhythm as I arranged the newly acquired collection of Victorian-era mirrors. Each one possessed its own unique character, ornate frames of tarnished silver, weathered gold leaf, and hand-carved wood that told stories of the decades they had witnessed. The late afternoon light filtered through the rain-streaked windows, casting soft shadows that danced across the shop's wooden floors. I had acquired the collection just yesterday from an elderly collector who insisted on selling them all together, her voice trembling with an urgency I couldn't quite understand. Her parting words still lingered in my mind. Remember, some reflections are better left unseen. At the time, I had dismissed it as the mysterious way older collectors often spoke about their treasured possessions. The air in the shop held that particular scent unique to antique stores, a mixture of old wood, aged paper, and the subtle metallic tang of tarnished metals. As I carefully unwrapped each mirror from its protective cloth, the familiar scents mingled with the earthy dampness brought in by the rain. The soft creaking of the old floorboards beneath my feet provided a gentle counterpoint to the rainfall's steady rhythm. The first peculiarity I noticed was subtle, so subtle that I nearly missed it. In the largest mirror, an ornate piece with a frame of intertwined bronze roses, my reflection seemed slightly delayed, as if it took a fraction of a second too long to follow my movements. I attributed it to the poor lighting and my tired eyes, but something about it made me pause, my fingers lingering on the cool metal of the frame. Moving through the collection, I began to notice other small inconsistencies. In some mirrors, the reflections appeared slightly darker than they should have been, while in others, the background details of the shop seemed to shift ever so slightly, like ripples in a still pond. But it was the smallest mirror, a delicate piece with a silver frame adorned with carved moonflowers, that truly captured my attention. When I looked into it, I saw nothing at all. No reflection, just a surface as dark and deep as a midnight lake. The rational part of my mind suggested that it must be a trick of the light, perhaps some unique quality of the old glass or the angle at which I held it. Yet as I moved from mirror to mirror, I began to notice a pattern emerging. Each reflection seemed to hold something different, some barely noticeable variation from reality that made me question my own perception. In one mirror, the raindrops on the window behind me appeared to fall upward. In another, the shadows cast by my antique lamps moved independently of their source, like dark creatures stretching their limbs. Yet these anomalies were so gentle, so subtle, that they felt more like a whispered secret than a cause for alarm. As the afternoon deepened into evening, the rain continued its soft symphony against the windows. The natural light grew dimmer, and the old brass lamps cast their warm glow across the shop, creating pools of gentle illumination that seemed to make the mirrors come alive with shifting shadows and subtle movements. I found myself drawn to a particular mirror, its frame carved with intricate patterns of intertwined vines and leaves. As I gazed into it, I noticed something extraordinary. The reflection showed not the cluttered interior of my shop, but what appeared to be an endless gallery of other mirrors, stretching into an impossible distance. Each mirror in this reflected gallery seemed to hold its own unique view, like windows into different versions of reality. The discovery should have been unsettling, yet there was something oddly peaceful about it. The reflected gallery seemed to pulse with a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm that matched the falling rain. I found myself swaying slightly, my breaths becoming deeper and more measured as I studied the endless reflections. Time began to flow differently as I moved from mirror to mirror. Each one revealed its own subtle mystery, a shift in perspective, a slight alteration of reality, a glimpse into something just beyond normal perception. In one, I saw myself from behind, even though I faced the mirror directly. In another, my reflection appeared to be reading a book, though my hands were empty. The most intriguing mirror was one with a frame of darkened silver, its surface bearing the patina of centuries. When I looked into it, I saw not myself, but what appeared to be memories, gentle, flowing images of people and places I had never known. They moved like watercolors bleeding into one another, each scene dissolving gracefully into the next. As night began to fall in earnest, the rain grew softer, becoming little more than a whisper against the windows. The lamps in the shop seemed to dim and brighten in a slow, peaceful rhythm, like the breathing of some sleeping creature. The mirrors continued their subtle display, each one offering its own quiet mystery. I began to understand why the elderly collector had been so insistent that the mirrors stay together. They weren't just individual pieces, but parts of a whole, each one contributing to a larger story that I was only beginning to comprehend. The longer I spent with them, the more I realized that their true nature wasn't meant to be understood in any conventional sense. In the growing darkness, some of the mirrors began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow, like moonlight captured in old glass. The light was soft and soothing, creating patterns on the walls that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The air in the shop grew thick with a gentle heaviness, like the moment just before falling asleep. I found myself seated in my old leather armchair, surrounded by the collection. The mirrors now seemed to be having a silent conversation among themselves, exchanging reflections and shadows in a languid dance. The rain had almost stopped, leaving behind a profound silence, broken only by the occasional drop of water and the distant sound of wind in the eaves. As my eyes grew heavy, I noticed one final detail. In every mirror, my reflection had taken on a peaceful, dreaming expression, even though I knew I was still awake. Or was I? The line between reality and reflection had become as fluid as the rain running down the windows, as nebulous as the shadows playing across the shop's walls. The last thing I remember before drifting off was the gentle glow of the mirrors, each one holding a different dream, a different possibility, a different version of reality. The elderly collector's words came back to me, but now they held a different meaning. Some reflections are better left unseen, perhaps, but others offer glimpses into the gentle mysteries that exist just beyond our normal perception. When I awoke the next morning, the rain had stopped and sunlight streamed through the windows. The mirrors appeared perfectly normal, reflecting only what they should. Yet sometimes, in certain lights, or at particular moments when the shop is quiet and the air is heavy with anticipation, I catch glimpses of those other realities. They're always there, just beneath the surface, waiting patiently for someone to look deeply enough to see them. I've never tried to sell the mirrors. They remain arranged throughout the shop, each in its carefully chosen place. Customers often pause before them, their expressions growing distant and dreamy, as if they too can sense the gentle mysteries held within the aged glass. Some ask about purchasing individual pieces, but I always decline, remembering the elderly collector's insistence that they stay together. In quiet moments, when the day's light begins to fade and the shop fills with shadows, I still sit among the mirrors, watching as they slowly come alive with their subtle variations of reality. There's a profound peace in accepting that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only experienced. The collection of empty mirrors, as I've come to call them, continues to hold their secrets, sharing them only in glimpses and whispers with those who take the time to truly look. And sometimes in that delicate moment between wakefulness and sleep, I wonder if we're all just reflections ourselves, existing in countless variations across countless mirrors, each one holding its own gentle truth, its own quiet story, its own peaceful mystery.